Good evening. My name is Dick Clay. I'm the president and the CEO of the Filson Historical Society. I'm so glad you're able to join us for tonight's lecture. I'm happy to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Marcia Chatelain. Marcia Chatelain was raised in Chicago. She's a graduate undergrad of the University of Missouri at Columbia, and her PhD in American history is from Brown University. She currently is a Provost's Distinguished Associate Professor of History and African American Studies at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Previously, she was a Reach for Excellence Assistant Professor of Honors and African American Studies at the University of Oklahoma in Norman. Her first book, Southside Girls, Growing Up in the Great Migration, reimagined the mass exodus of Black Southerners to the urban North from the perspective of girls and teenage women. Her most recent book, and what she'll be lecturing about this evening, is Franchise, The Golden Arches in Black America. I'll now turn the program over to Dr. Chatelain and then rejoin her after her presentation to moderate your questions as time permits. Thank you. We're glad you're here.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome. And thank you so much to the good folks at Filson for inviting me to talk about my most recent book, Franchise, The Golden Arches in Black America, which is an exploration of the relationship among the civil rights movement, the movement for African-American entrepreneurship, and the emergence of fast food in African-American communities after 1968. At this time, I'm going to share my screen so we can walk through a presentation about Franchise. And then afterward, I hope we have an opportunity for questions and comments and reflections about history, about what we eat, and our ideas about community. And here we go. So what initially drew me to this research was growing up in Chicago in the 1980s and 1990s. And being a child of the 1990s, I was very much interested in politics. So for those of you who do not know who this gentleman is, he is Bill Clinton, and he was president of the United States in the 1990s. And one of the features of President Clinton's public persona was that he occasionally enjoyed McDonald's. And this was something that was sometimes lampooned on television shows like Saturday Night Live. And the fact that the president enjoyed McDonald's was not just a reflection of his taste, but was also a reflection of the generation in which he emerged. The reason why President Clinton's affinity for fast food is fascinating to me was because when Toni Morrison wrote in The New Yorker in 1998 that Bill Clinton was perhaps America's first Black president, people often raised this issue when the real first Black president was elected in 2008. But if you go back to that essay, which was under the Talk of the Town feature, what Morrison was talking about was the ways that Bill Clinton was racialized in the similar ways that African Americans are pursued in the criminal justice system. She was making parallels between his impeachment hearings and the criminal justice system. But in one of the paragraphs that enumerated Bill Clinton's Blackness, she talked about the fact that he was from the South, that he played the saxophone and enjoyed jazz, and that he was a junk food loving boy from Arkansas, as many of ways in which he was racialized. And I thought that was really fascinating because we know that people eat fast food all over the globe. But what are the ways that fast food particularly signal ideas about race, about location, and our sense of where fast food resides and where it is most dangerous? And this led me to thinking about where McDonald's has been in the history of African American people. And this image is from 2014 in Ferguson, Missouri. And like many people, I watched a lot of cable news that summer as the uprising in Ferguson unfolded as a result of the death of Michael Brown in August of 2014. And this image of this McDonald, I think, really captured the complexity and the many strands of the ways that fast food appears in African American communities. This McDonald's location on Florissant Avenue was one of the few McDonald's locations, or one of the few businesses open during the uprising. And if you went inside during those tense nights in Ferguson, Missouri, you would see state troopers and police officers engaged in shift changes. You would see journalists who were using the free Wi-Fi to send stories to editors. You would see newscasters outside. And in the middle of this chaos, McDonald's in some ways served as a beacon for people who were exhausted and overwhelmed. In fact, this McDonald's was the site of some damage after protesters tried to enter the restaurant in order to get milk to soothe the impact of tear gas that had been deployed into the night sky. And so when we think about how McDonald's appears in parts of America that have been left behind by economic development, that still bear the many scars of racial injustice, this image in Ferguson in 2014 reminded me of images like this in Washington, D.C. in 1968, after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. What very few people realize is that that picture in 2014, the roots of that, the roots of McDonald's in African American communities began in 1968. And what my book looks at is this moment in which the fast food industry started to focus on African American communities as a response to some of the racial uprisings and tensions that emerged because of a lack of opportunity, because of confrontations with the police and state authorities, as well as a sensibility that the civil rights strategies of the 1950s and that had been exemplified by Martin Luther King needed to shift and change towards business and economic development. I think that when I first published this book in January of 2020, I was hoping that people could make the connections between the present and the past. But after the explosive summer that we've all experienced with the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, some of the same types of strands have become even more and more visible. How do we respond to racial injustice? And what is the role of private business? And what is the strategy of civil rights when we think about it in terms of economic enrichment? And so franchise, the Golden Arches in Black America, is trying to look at the origins of those ideas, why we are hearing calls to support Black businesses, and the limits of that strategy for delivering true racial justice. Growing up in Chicago, I often went to McDonald's, and there was a McDonald's on the south side of Chicago that had a plaque that said, on December 21st, 1968, this location was franchised to the first McDonald's African American owner operator. Now, this is a curious bit of history, and it's no coincidence that McDonald's extended the opportunity for an African American to franchise a McDonald's 8 months after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. In fact, with the opening of this first McDonald's that was operated by an African American, McDonald's discovered an incredible opportunity financially and economically with African American communities who, for the first time, were being targets of the major fast food companies. And we'll talk a little bit about that trend shortly. So, in order to appreciate why fast food franchising was so popular and was so compelling in 1968, we have to understand what franchising is. Some of you in the audience may have invested in or may own a franchise, but a franchise essentially is a relationship between a major corporate head and its associates, its franchise locations. Most of us have been to a franchise to do business. If we've been to a Dunkin' Donuts, if we've mailed something at a UPS store, or had our oil changed at a Jiffy Lube. There are 247,000 fast food restaurants in the United States, and they represent a third of all businesses that use this franchise model. Now, in many ways, the franchise, in my opinion, is the most American kind of business because what franchises offer is the possibility of becoming very wealthy and becoming very influential by following a set of rules. Franchisees have to comply by the laws of the franchise organization. So if I franchise a Wendy's and I find a deal on tomatoes, I can't just go buy those tomatoes. And if I own a Kentucky Fried Chicken and I want meatloaf to be on the menu, I'm not allowed to just offer meatloaf. There are a lot of rules to how franchising works. And McDonald's, in many ways, in its expansion as a franchise, was able to create an incredibly efficient and a rapidly growing system that for many years had not entered predominantly African American communities until after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. So I'm going to walk you through the chapters in the book as a way to explore my thinking of how we understand McDonald's as an excellent case study in the various dynamics about race and inequality in the United States. So the first chapter of the book is called Fast Food Civil Rights, and it talks about the founding of McDonald's from the perspective of African American history. If you've read some business books about McDonald's or saw the film starring Michael Keaton, the founder, about Ray Kroc, who really created the McDonald's we know today, you see a story about innovation. You see a story about mid-century consumer markets. You see a story about selling hamburgers and French fries in suburbs and bedroom communities. But from my perspective, I think we have to understand the growth of McDonald's as contingent upon systems of inequality that were central to America's post-World War II identity. If we think about the fact that the expansion of fast food was made possible by the expansion of the highway system, then we know that the highway system was often created at the peril and at the expense of African American communities. If we think about the fact that veterans were able to use GI Bill provisions in order to open fast food franchises and get capital from banks, then we also know that the fast food franchising system was also engaged in the racially discriminatory practices of bank lending that kept African Americans out of business for decades. We also know that the fast food industry relied on the marketing of its products to children who lived in suburbs. Suburban families were able to invest in real estate as a result of not only GI Bill provisions, but their value, their assets that they had through their home were protected by racially discriminatory practices. And so I think it's important for us to understand that the fast food industry is really representative of many facets of American history that was built upon a kind of exclusion that was never uttered and was never fully articulated. In addition to looking at the racial origins of the building of the fast food industry, the first chapter looks at civil rights activities in which McDonald's was the target. And I think for me as a researcher, this was probably one of the most fascinating discoveries in my process, to find out that McDonald's, along with Katz's Drugs and Woolworths, were targets of sit-in protests that were ignited after the February 1st, 1960 protest by the 4 students at North Carolina A&T, that McDonald's was practicing segregation in the South in cities like Pine Bluff, Arkansas, Memphis, Tennessee, throughout North Carolina, and they were a target of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, as well as the Congress of Racial Equality and the NAACP. But curiously, when we think about the desegregation of public accommodations prior to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, rarely does McDonald's and images of those confrontations emerge in our public consciousness. And so in many ways, McDonald's has crafted its own narrative of its entry point into the civil rights struggle after 1968, when it opened its doors to African Americans and franchising. The second chapter is called From Sit-In to Drive-Through, and it talks about two intersecting moments in African American political history: the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and the decision on the part of some of King's heirs to pivot the civil rights struggle towards economic development, towards business development, under this umbrella called Black capitalism. And if you're familiar with some of Richard Nixon's initiatives in the 1970s that were supposed to cater to African Americans, you know that Richard Nixon was a big proponent of Black capitalism. Well, in relationship to those initiatives that were supported by the White House, the Office of Minority Enterprise, and various councils that were supposed to encourage Black-owned businesses in the communities that had been ravaged by uprisings throughout the late 60s and early 1970s, few realized how many African Americans used those resources to enter fast food franchising. If you are a fan of podcasts, I had the pleasure of working with America's Test Kitchen on 2 episodes of Proof, their podcast. And I talked about in one of the episodes, excuse me, the rise of Brady Keys. Brady Keys was a former NFL star who played for the Pittsburgh Steelers, and he was able to amass $9 million in loans and grants with the help of the Nixon administration to create his own brand of fried chicken restaurants called All Pro Chicken. And he later became a franchisee of Kentucky Fried Chicken. And in fact, his son Rodney has a fabulous story about the Colonels showing up at their house when he was in high school. But all of this is to say that when we think of Nixon's Black capitalism, and we think of the various efforts to encourage Black-owned businesses, people often look at this period of time as a great failure, because the businesses that were started on the local community level, the small manufacturing companies, they didn't survive into the 1980s. But what few people realize is that those financial resources were also used by people entering fast food franchising in order to expand their presence within the system. The third chapter is called The Burger Boycott and the Ballot Box, and it examines a period in Cleveland, Ohio, in which a Black nationalist group called Operation Black Unity challenged McDonald's presence on the east side of Cleveland, the predominantly Black part of the city. And in this chapter, I explore the early expansion strategies of McDonald's into African American communities. Part of the impetus for McDonald's to recruit Black franchise owners was because some of their white franchise owners no longer wanted to do business in areas in which there had been uprisings. They were afraid of further property damage. They were afraid that they would be a target of the animus of the community if they continued to operate. So McDonald's allowed some of the franchise owners to leave behind their urban businesses and move to the suburbs. And in their place came African American franchise owners. Now in Cleveland, the story was a little bit different. There were successful fast food franchises in Cleveland on the east side, but African American civil rights organizations questioned whether it was appropriate for white franchise owners to profit so handily on the backs of African Americans. And so I look at this moment prior to the re-election of Carl Stokes, the first Black mayor of a major city, as he is trying to make a case that he can be a mayor for all people. African American civil rights groups are boycotting McDonald's and effectively boycotting McDonald's in order to pressure McDonald's to bring in more Black franchise owners in that part of the city. And so what I reflect on is this shift in political strategy from the 1960s, in which people are protesting to get access to public accommodations, to a very 1970s moment in which the struggle is about ownership of those public accommodations. And I talk about the various ways that Cleveland was going to foreshadow the ways that the first African American mayors of major cities, people like Harold Washington in Chicago or Tom Bradley in Los Angeles, would feel the pressure to get involved in these conflicts between African American communities and franchised McDonald's locations. I really enjoyed writing this chapter of the book. It includes a lot of very colorful characters, including someone who later fled to go to Guyana shortly before the emergence of the People's Temple in Jonestown. There are all sorts of plots and conspiracies. But what this highlights is the fact that McDonald's was a source of a lot of anxiety as well as a lot of conflict as they were expanding into these communities. The next chapter examines this idea of bending the golden arches. And I continue along the thread of challenges to McDonald's presence in African American communities. So, as McDonald's is expanding in various urban locations, it's doing very well in Chicago. It's expanding into St. Louis, Los Angeles. Eventually, McDonald's will come to Harlem. But in some cities, McDonald's was still viewed with a lot of suspicion on the part of African Americans. So I talk about instances like those that happened in Portland, Oregon, where that top photograph is with a gentleman who's having breakfast with some children, in which the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense in Portland, Oregon challenges McDonald's to participate in its free breakfast program for children. This party chapter is accused of bombing the McDonald's in retaliation, and there's a lot of question about whether that actually happened. But the conflict about who has the right to who generate money, generate profits within a Black community was of central concern in Portland as well as other cities. Additionally, I think that as McDonald's expanded its footprint in Black communities, people started to have a set of expectations that McDonald's would become a good neighbor. They would be philanthropic and they would have rights and responsibilities within that communities that were tied to its ability to serve the people. I talk about the Ogons neighborhood in Philadelphia that created a campaign against McDonald's, not because people were anti-fast food. And I want to highlight an important issue. When we think about critiques of fast food today in communities of color, we often think about it in terms of people having issues with the nutritional content, or maybe the marketing to children, or even the nature of the jobs that McDonald's offer. But in the early 1970s, it was about community control. Who has a say on what kind of businesses will be in our communities at a point where so many businesses were fleeing and so many crucial federal dollars were leaving the urban core? And so in the Ogons neighborhood, people organized and said, we're not anti-fast food, but we want to decide what comes in next. And we could use a youth center. We could use mental health counseling. We could use a library. We don't need another fast food restaurant. Another strategy of trying to slow the power and the presence of McDonald's in Black neighborhoods was to create competing brands that argued that they were authentically Black owned. One of the dilemmas that emerges in the 70s and 1980s is when civil rights organizations want to boycott McDonald's. They're not sure if they should only boycott locations that are franchised by white people, if they should boycott selectively and still participate in buying from African Americans, or if they should boycott the entire brand. Because of that franchise system, if a Black owned franchise is getting profits, some of it will go upward to the corporate head. So people like Muhammad Ali and Mahalia Jackson leased their names to these different business enterprises that represented themselves as not just Black owned, but uniquely poised to do economic development in various communities. And so Mahalia's Glory Fried Chicken and Muhammad Ali's Champ Burger was promoted as an investment vehicle, a redevelopment vehicle in urban neighborhoods. As the story of McDonald's and African American communities unfolds in my book, I wanted to spend some time to acknowledge the incredible cultural work of this process of McDonald's reaching out to Black communities. And I talk about the advertising. These were done by a very important African-American advertising firm based in Chicago, Burrell Communications, that really took a lot of time to capture African-American families and culture and speak to the African-American market. And I think it's important to notice that from our perspective in 2020, some of these ads are a little cheesy, some seem a little cringy, but I want to make sure that people understand that in the early 1970s, why this was so powerful. If you think about the fact that African Americans were not federally protected to be in public accommodations until 1964, an ad campaign in 1974 that spoke to your community could be really powerful. From our perspective today, McDonald's is not very special. It's everywhere. The food may not be so great. But I think that we have to understand what it meant for African Americans to see themselves in print culture, to see themselves in advertising. And one of the arguments that I make is that McDonald's was very, very influential in normalizing the practice of observing the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday through its networks of Black franchise owners who supported the holiday on the local level, and I think really influenced McDonald's intervention in creating opportunities for the larger corporation to acknowledge the King holiday shortly after its passage in 1983. And today we continue to see those strands in which McDonald's underwrites a lot of Black cultural forms like the gospel music tour. In the 1980s, the American Double Dutch League was very important for McDonald's promotions. And these Double Dutchers appeared on a national ad campaign, as well as the McDonald's All-American basketball game. And so I think the cultural work of the fast food industry is just as important as the ways that they have changed our tastes and our eating practices. The last two chapters of the book go into the 1980s and 1990s. And the chapter about the 1980s talks about this conflict between an African American franchise owner in Los Angeles and McDonald's corporate. And he charges that he is being redlined, which essentially means being racially excluded from expanding his franchises outside of South Los Angeles. And he seeks help from the NAACP to adjudicate this issue with McDonald's. And what starts to happen in this period of time is that disgruntled Black franchise owners are arguing that, yes, they are becoming quite wealthy as franchise owners, and yes, they have pretty successful businesses, but that McDonald's is engaging in discriminatory practices that's really limiting their business capacity. And as McDonald's and other corporations, you may be familiar with the Coors boycott of the 1980s, as they are negotiating various consumer boycotts, the NAACP emerges as a very powerful voice to create fair share agreements. And fair share agreements are these agreements that are entered voluntarily with corporations that say that they will put more money into Black banks, they will hire more Black attorneys, they will enter into contracts with Black advertising agencies and various Black-owned entities, which I think is fascinating and also opens the door for even more franchise locations to open in African-American communities. One of the terms of some of these agreements, and Kentucky Fried Chicken has one and Burger King has one at some point in the 80s and early 90s, it actually speeds up the hyper concentration of fast food in Black communities that we think about today. And so the National Black McDonald's Operators Association is really pivotal in these negotiations. And I think it's interesting that recently 52 Black franchise owners filed suit against McDonald's. And the claims that they're making are very similar to the claims that are made in the 1980s, that there are racially restrictive practices afoot that will ultimately imperil the capacity for their businesses to compete. And I think that these arguments really highlight the very, very, very important limitations that we have to recognize in thinking about business development as an answer to the questions of racial injustice. And the final chapter is called The Miracle of the Golden Arches. And it starts in 1992 in Los Angeles, California, after the acquittal of the police officers who beat motorist Rodney King. And after a week of uprising in Los Angeles, McDonald's issued a statement that said that none of its restaurants in South Los Angeles, which was at the eye of the storm, were harmed in the chaos of those days in May because they had engaged in socially progressive action in the recruitment of Black franchise owners in 1968. And I thought that claim was kind of a bold claim nonetheless. But I thought it was really powerful the ways that McDonald's had grafted itself onto a narrative about civil rights, and that investment in 68 was paying dividends in 1992. And finally, as I conclude my formal presentation, and I can't wait to answer your questions, I think that fast food continues to create a lot of questions for us about the nature of health and nutrition, about the qualities of jobs in America. But I think that it's important for us to note that no matter what our position is on fast food, hate it or love it, that fast food provides us an opportunity to better understand the ways that we respond to communities in crisis, the limitations of business to do so, and that the golden arches in Black America isn't just one thing. It is not necessarily only a nutritional scourge. It is not just a problem in terms of the jobs it provides. It is also a place in which many African Americans found economic power, where they found opportunities to expand their creative and their business practices. And it was a place in which African American consumers could find themselves part of systems that had excluded them for decades. And so when we think about the relationships between ourselves and consumer markets and ourselves in the fast food industry, I think the best way to sum it up is it's complicated. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions.
Dr. Chatelain, thank you so much. This is fascinating. There are several questions. What was the most illuminating piece of research you found while working on the book?
In addition to just learning about the sit-in history that pivoted around McDonald's, I talk about in the book a protest that is done by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the NAACP in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. And McDonald's is really the site of a showdown between protesters and local folks and the police. And the franchise owner actually files an injunction against these organizations from protesting in front of them. A young protester is ammonia is thrown in her face. I mean, this is like very, very powerful stuff. And so I just think it is fascinating how McDonald's is written out of that narrative of the sit-in struggle. The other thing I thought was so interesting were the number of people who were really caught up in the fast food frenzy of the 1960s and 70s. Joe Namath gave his name to a brand called Broadway Joe's. It was a roast beef concept. Muhammad Ali selling hamburgers. Minnie Pearl's Chicken was another chicken company that came out of Tennessee. And so the way that fast food franchising just captured the imagination of so many people. I found out that the late Julian Bond, who I always knew as kind of the elder statesman of Black America, he had franchised 2 Dairy Queens and a Wishbone Chicken in Atlanta. And that's because people were so, I think, pardon the pun, they were so hungry for something that could look like it could really bring capital and resources into communities.
Wow. In your research, did you come across Louisville's Junior Bridgman, a most successful Black fast food franchise businessman?
Junior Bridgman is a legend in terms of fast food, and I think he also was involved in Pepsi distribution, if I'm correct. That is a really important element to why franchising was so popular in the 1970s and continues to be popular for the portfolios of professional athletes in retirement. That's why Brady Keyes was such a compelling figure, not only for the Nixon administration, but for African Americans interested in business, because NFL salaries were not comparable to today's money back in the 60s and 70s. And for African Americans who were able to actually have somewhat of a household or brand name, they needed to find kind of a place to pivot. And the fast food industry provided incredible resources, particularly for Black athletes who were among that first group that had played in the NFL and the NBA.
How many McDonald's franchises are in the United States, and how many are owned by Blacks?
Oh my gosh, I always lose this
Oh,
number.
wait, I need to add something. This is wonderful. P.S. The sausage burritos are a guilty pleasure.
I feel like I've eaten everything on the McDonald's menu up to like 2005, 2006. I think I missed the sausage burritos, but I do remember liking the bacon, egg, and cheese muffin. But I think that I'm in a crowd in Kentucky, so I don't know if I've offended you by saying that I like the biscuits at McDonald's, but I think they're delicious. Um,
Agreed.
there are fewer than 300 Black-owned franchise, and this is an issue of contention that was part of the recent lawsuit. Um, a group of franchise owners have argued that over the past 2 decades, McDonald's has not been committed to diversity in the ways that it was before, and I think that the numbers of Black franchisees today is in the 210s, 220s. Kate Taylor of Business Insider magazine did some reporting on McDonald's recently, and she found that there is about a $60,000 per month discrepancy on the earning potential of a Black-owned franchise compared to the white counterparts. And these are the issues that some of the franchise owners are taking up with McDonald's. More than 90% of McDonald's locations are franchised, and the rest are company owned.
Got it. The questions are now rolling in. Here's one from Matt Rubin. The last one, by the way, was from Jack Bramer. From Matt Rubin to everyone. My memory of 1980s advertising is that McDonald's was more aggressive than other businesses in marketing toward the African American community. Would you agree? And if so, do you think their approach was a consequence of pressure from the African American community, a more straightforward way to capture market share, or some combination?
So the initiative to actually market to African Americans came from the early members of the National Black McDonald's Operators Association. So if you have a fast food franchise, you have your rent for your property, you've got your supplier costs, you've got your employee costs, but you also pay into something called an advertising fund. So it's national advertising fund, and then sometimes there's a regional advertising fund. So for the Black franchise owners who were making very good money in the late 60s and early 1970s, they were concerned that they were paying into an advertising fund and none of the advertising was resonating with the communities in which they worked. And they came together and they brought in Burrell Communications. And Burrell Communications was really at the top of what they would call multi-ethnic or ethnic marketing, because they were bringing in Black models, musicians, celebrities to promote the products. And so that pressure came from the franchise owners who felt like they needed to get something out of it. And then they realized that this advertising worked really well. And so they continued in that vein. I think you're right. McDonald's was probably the most distinguished in the 1980s in having a lot of advertisement towards African Americans, not just the one commercial. And they also were able to bring in people like Patti LaBelle and Michael Jordan, people who were popular across racial lines, and make them the kind of face of the product. And so they were very, very sophisticated. And then I think there was an expectation on the part of consumers that they would take that and they would spin it into sponsorships of Black organizations and events.
Here's a good one from Dion Griffiths. Can you talk more about McDonald's philanthropic endeavors with Black communities and Black civic organizations?
So one of the reasons why I think there was such excitement about the possibility of Black franchisees is because Black franchisees are very much consistent with the history of African American business people, not just being people who are making money, but people who are very much invested in, building Black communities. I mean, this is something that extends into the 19th century. And I think the great historian Shanette Garrett is in the audience, who wrote an excellent book about Black women in banking and finance. And so Black business owners have this kind of unelected position in communities, and Black franchise owners were no different. And so the types of organizations that they would support, the NAACP, United Negro College Fund, I don't know, for those of you who are of a certain age, the Lou Rawls UNCF telethon, often you would see Black franchise owners there. You see incredible synergy happening with these local organizations. And there was an expectation in the early days of franchising that you would give to local, JC's clubs, you would give to the Shriners Hospital. And so that's an expectation of that relationship. And African-American franchise owners were at the forefront of that.
Ray and Helen Kroc were the founders, I guess, of McDonald's. Is that right?
Well, founders with an asterisk. So Richard and Maurice McDonald, who are from New Hampshire, founded McDonald's in Southern California in San Bernardino. They sold McDonald's to Ray Kroc, who had been selling milkshake machines, and Ray Kroc moved it to Illinois, the operations, and he created the franchising giant that we know today.
Were the Krocs formative in making sure that franchises went to African Americans, and what was their role in McDonald's record, so to speak, of race relations or lack thereof?
So it's like I like to say about Richard Nixon, Ray Kroc was not a civil rights guy, but he understood how to make money with McDonald's. And so he gave a quote once that said, McDonald's belongs in the suburbs. We're really not interested in the urban market. McDonald's grew up in the suburbs. But I think what he understood fundamentally was that expanding in the urban core could be good business, because what happens during the oil embargoes in the 1970s is these urban stores continue to perform in a way that suburban stores don't. Families are not going to waste their precious oil to drive to McDonald's. The recession was really hitting the fast food industry hard, but these urban stores, which they called Black stores back then, were still doing well. So Ray Kroc understood that. He could often say things that rubbed people the wrong way. He was not very comfortable, I think, with African Americans at McDonald's kind of corporate, but he understood that when they are in the communities and they make money, that that's something that he could support. What's interesting about his widow, Joan Kroc, after his death, she gave a lot of her money to liberal causes. There's a wonderful book called Ray and Joan about her legacy, and National Public Radio, the Peace Studies Institute at Notre Dame. I mean, she was very much of a different political ilk, but a lot of that work happened upon his death.
Here is another good one from Brenda Peterson Conway. What other franchises supported and continue to support Black capitalism?
So after McDonald's kind of started doing these initiatives, the other brands followed suit because they saw how well it was happening. So Burger King was kind of next in terms of the advertising. They partnered also with Brady Keyes, who had a stake in KFC. Kentucky Fried Chicken, I think, was third. So it's McDonald's, Burger King, Kentucky Fried Chicken that started to get engaged more and more in Black franchising. And then all of the other brands kind of followed suit. But I think in many ways, McDonald's was really unmatched in the level of organization, in the recruitment and the sponsorship. And I just wanted to share that book title with you in full, Banking on Freedom, Black Women in US Finance Before the New Deal, by Shanette Garrett Scott, who teaches at the University of Mississippi. And these types of books, I think, are so good to read in this moment as we try to think about what's the role of business in answering the call of racial injustice.
Another question. I did not realize that Richard Nixon was a proponent of Black capitalism. That's again from Brenda Peterson Conway.
Richard Nixon was a savvy guy, and one of the reasons why it was easy for him to support Black capitalism is that if you support measures that increase Black businesses and Black communities, you never have to touch the issue of desegregated neighborhoods, housing, schools. You never really get to the heart of racial injustice, but you always have something tangible to point to. In the podcast that I did recently with Rodney Keyes, the son of Brady Keyes, he said, Richard Nixon told his dad, you better open up, a restaurant in Cleveland, Ohio, so I can point to voters in Ohio, something I've done for the Black community. And he did that. I mean, if you look at Richard Nixon's many friends, James Brown was a friend of Nixon. And James Brown gave a press conference in 1969 where he said, I'm no longer doing music. I'm going to focus solely on my new franchise called Golden Platter Restaurants. And of course, he didn't do that, right? So you see the way that celebrity culture, people like Wilt Chamberlain, the other famous Jim Brown, the football player, all of these guys were very much invested in Black capitalism. And even if they did not feel like Richard Nixon had a heart for service, they understood that the White House was facilitating something economically that people could possibly take advantage of.
Here's a good one. This is from Jay Gulick. Have you decided on a topic for your next book? And I'll add a comma and a phrase so that you can come and visit with us again.
Oh, I can't wait till we can all travel again. So the book comes out in paperback in January, and my literary agent is like, what's the next book? And I think I would like to write about television judge shows, Judge Judy, The People's Court, because I think that they are an interesting slice of life that come out of this very moment in the 1970s where people are trying to talk about control of processes. The fact that there is a television show called The People's Court is not incidental. It's this idea that everyday people have a stake in observing and developing their communities. And the fact that we have a form of entertainment in which poor and working class people are trying to litigate the issues that come up in their lives financially, socially. So I think these shows are such a fascinating way of understanding social class and economics in America. And the fact that they've become a kind of form of entertainment is something that has always been quite interesting to me.
This is an important and deep question that's coming up. It's from Susan Burfield. Could you please share your thoughts on the limits of business to address or redress racial inequality?
I think business will never be able to do this because they are in service to the bottom line. And so if we are going to have a society that wants to address racial inequality and wants to have capitalism and business, then business has to be out of the service of redress. And what do I mean by that? So I would prefer to live in a context in which businesses pay a great deal of taxes in order to be businesses, and that tax money is used to deal with inequality. So it goes into affordable housing, it goes into free college, it goes into free healthcare, so that we don't have to worry about what businesses are doing in order for these things to happen. And so I want McDonald's to thrive in making burgers. I want McDonald's to not be engaged in the question of racial justice because we use the public sector, all of us together in one nation, as united as we can be, to really grapple with those issues and to serve each other. I think business will always be in the service of its profits, but people can always be in service of each other.
Let me add something to that then as a practicing lawyer for 42 years. And frequently we would respond to requests for proposals that would be extremely detailed in how many African Americans do you have on your staff, how many African American lawyers and how many are partners, how many are equity partners, et cetera. How many are on your management committee? And McDonald's, as I recall, certainly was among the major corporations that sent those RFPs and asked those questions. In your judgment, is that a legitimate role for business to play?
I think that it can be an ethical and discerning act. I think the danger of it is that you know, a lot of these opportunities emerged because communities were in real crisis. There was a crisis of schools, there was a crisis of housing, there's a crisis of jobs, there's a crisis of police brutality. As wonderful as it is that McDonald's wants to be discerning about, contracting with companies that were diverse,
It's vendors. Yeah.
that the hiring of Black lawyers does nothing for people who are most vulnerable in our society. And I think this is one of the great kind of bait and switches of thinking about answering racial justice by diversifying white collar positions. I think it is important for us to have diversity in all industries, but the idea that giving someone the opportunity to open a franchise becomes the response to people saying we need good jobs and we need healthcare, we need schools for our children. These are two different things. It's like if I came to your house, Richard, and I took a sandwich out of your refrigerator and I gave you a Pepsi in exchange. It would be very confusing because you had a sandwich and I need to give you back a sandwich.
Thank you. Here's one from, I don't know who sent it, but it's a great question. Think fast food. I guess, fast food has caused many problems with health, plus the inhumane treatment of the animals. Did you come across any research in your research or think about those issues in the context of your book?
I really wanted to think about the non-food ways that fast food engages with community. I think that due to incredible work by public health officials, nutritionists, we have a sense of, the negative nutritional impacts of fast food. But I think it's really hard for us to imagine the other ways that fast food has created affective bonds in African American communities. So usually the intervention is, can we get people to eat healthier foods? But I think my concern is, can we understand the complexity of this relationship? Can we understand why McDonald's is meaningful to so many people and why the possibility of being employed by or being served by a Black franchise owner is really exciting in this context? Because I think that if we have a really clear grasp of that history, that our interventions about what people use fast food for becomes more sophisticated. If it was only hamburgers and fries, I think we could have solved that problem. But if it's about community, if it's about the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday, if it's about one of the few places you could go, when I was on the road in the before times in Kansas City, a woman said to me, I remember the first time I went to McDonald's for ice cream. It was exciting because in the Jim Crow South, we never went for ice cream. My grandmother did not want us to use a window marked colored. So we went to McDonald's, as a young adult, and I was able to get an ice cream. I want to take seriously those emotional ties and those community ties in thinking through how we can understand fast food's impact.
Wow. This is from Becky Shaw. Does McDonald's offer a different menu in predominantly African American neighborhoods versus mostly white neighborhoods?
There's some regional differences in the menu. I don't know if folks who are coming in from Kentucky, if they have grits on your menu. Sometimes grits will appear, sweet tea will appear in some menus. One of the things I found in my research was the development of the chicken sandwich was very interesting and kind of controversial with African Americans because when the sandwich was created, they said, well, where's the bone? And who eats chicken without gravy? And people really did not like a chicken sandwich. And the strategy there wasn't to necessarily improve the chicken sandwich, but to make the chicken sandwich feel special. There's all sorts of experimentations for regional taste, which can vary. But one of the things I talk about in the book is Kentucky Fried Chicken. As they were expanding in Black neighborhoods in the 80s and 90s, they came up with this idea of the neighborhood concept. And you could get sweet potato pies baked by a local, making everyone hungry, about from a local Black-owned bakery. That was when you start to see macaroni and cheese and greens and things like this. And a lot of that was test marketed in places like Detroit.
This is my last our last question, but it ties in, and I'm wondering if you, in your research, encountered it. In Kentucky, there is this wonderful film production artistic outfit called Apple Shop. They're out of Whitesburg, Kentucky, in southeastern part of the state. In 1991, Apple Shop did a film called Fast Food Women.
Oh, I've seen that.
All
and
right.
I've seen the classes.
Yep. I mean, it deals with the economics, the conditions of predominantly white women working in that part of the world in different fast food franchises, and how they were paid, what their lives were like, the bleakness and futility to some extent in what they were doing. In your thinking, in your research, as you look at that in the classes that you teach, as you think about these franchises in African American communities, do you have any thoughts or wisdom, advice to offer?
Yeah, I haven't seen that movie in years. And I remember there's this really poignant moment. This woman's rolling out biscuits by hand, which I don't think happens anymore. It's either at a Hardee's or Kentucky Fried Chicken. Um, I think about work and I think about labor and I think about this is what I will say. Um, because fast food is everywhere, because you can get it in an airport, you can get it in some hospitals, you can get it everywhere, that we think of it as not special. And because we sometimes don't think of the food as special, we lose sight of the incredible skill of the people who prepare it. I don't know about you, in pandemic, most of us have been making our every single meal. I'm done with cooking. And so when I think about during a lunch shift at a McDonald's between 12 and 2, hundreds, if not thousands of people are being served, it reminds us, I think when you study fast food and you take it seriously, the incredible, incredible talents that are within the fast food industry, from the creative people who, market McDonald land toys. There's a great archive here in DC at the Smithsonian of a gentleman who just made so many fast food products. I mean, we're talking the clamshell covers for your Big Mac. He made garbage cans, Tiffany style windows to look like Grimace. I mean, he made all of these things. And I think in this process, the creativity that I started to appreciate that the fast food industry has to kind of turn out, I started to really think about the level of sophistication and knowledge that the work requires, and the ways that we've degraded that so much, and some of it because of the people who are working in it. And I think, I think that regardless of where food is being served, when you think about the incredible skill of the people who had to harvest the food, process the food, and then cook the food, and then deliver it to it at a low cost, I think I'm just really humbled and chastened by that level. And I'm saddened by the way that we don't respect and honor it with wages and health insurance and paid sick leave, and the fact that we're in a pandemic and people are getting up every day and doing that kind of work. I think that when we think about that, it gives us an opportunity to imagine a different way of honoring that incredible, incredible amount of work.
They are first responders.
100%.
Yeah. I just want to say a few things. I wish I was a student and I wish I could be in one of your classes. This has been absolutely marvelous. I hope you will continue to write, and I hope that every time you write, you will come back and talk with the Filson, hopefully in person, so that all of us on this lecture can get to know you better. Thank you so much,
Thank
Marcia.
you so much.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you soon. Don't forget the Gertrude Polk Brown coming up on something really quite different, but fascinating. It'll be in early December. Teddy Roosevelt and J.P. Morgan and the wars they had. And then there is a blockbuster lineup for November. But I emphatically believe that every lecture we have is superb, but they're going to have a hard time keeping up with Dr. Chatelain. Thanks. See ya.
Good night.
Uh-huh.